He found himself drifting into the kitchen in the dead of night, seeking only a glass of water. But the sight that met him there froze him where he stood. His housemaid, a woman he'd perceived as nothing more than a quiet shadow, was immersed in her textbooks. What he chose to do in that moment would alter her world. The Crestwood estate was less a home than a testament to fortune and profound silence. Tucked away behind imposing iron gates and flawlessly sculpted hedges, it was the kind of place that had long ago shed the warmth of being a dwelling. Its marble floors gleamed with a relentless polish, reflecting more than they absorbed. Chandeliers, some brought from Prague, others passed down through generations, glittered like ice under the recessed lighting. Occasionally, classical music would whisper from hidden speakers. Yet even the solemn notes of Rachmaninoff and Chopin felt more like a ghostly echo than a welcoming sound. Not a single object was ever out of place. Nothing truly lived within these walls. Alistair Finch, the master of this silence, moved through his domain like a phantom. At 62 he was trim and poised, with eyes that were once described as piercing but now felt more like deep-sealed wells of forgotten water. He was a man who wore tailored suits as armor, and spoke with a sharp precision, even when silence would have been more powerful. Since the death of his wife, the estate had known no guests, no parties, no casual chatter. A staff that operated with near-perfect invisibility managed the home's flawless rhythm. Meals materialized on schedule. Rooms were maintained with a surgeon's precision. Fresh flowers, invariably white, were artfully arranged in silver vases and replaced every third day without exception. It was Ilara who arranged them. She was the maid, young and soft-spoken, forgettable in the way that service staff are often trained to become. She glided through the halls like a breath, never lingering, her words surfacing only when directly summoned. Her uniform, while impeccably clean, was perpetually a size too large. Her hair was always pulled back into a severe bun, and her gaze seldom rose to meet another's. To Alistair, she was just another cog in the silent machinery of his life, a part of the estate's seamless rhythm that ensured his days remained free of friction, until the night he discovered her secret life of study. It happened by pure chance. He had awakened, as he often did, at 2:15 a.m., his mind restless and his throat dry. The entire house was swathed in darkness, but a single thread of light was slicing across the floor from under the kitchen door. This was an anomaly. The staff retired punctually at 10, and the kitchen was forbidden territory after that hour. Still clad in his silk robe, he descended the grand staircase barefoot, his steps slow not from caution but from ingrained habit. The hush of the mansion was a sacred thing, and even its owner moved as if a single sound might shatter it. He half expected to find a malfunctioning light fixture, or perhaps a kitchen assistant who had forgotten to close a refrigerator door. But as he rounded the corner and pushed the heavy door inward, he stopped in mid-stride. Ilara was there, not performing a chore, but seated at the expansive marble island. The harsh overhead light cast a sterile glow on a tableau of thick textbooks, a spiral-bound notebook overflowing with dense, slanted script, and loose pages covered in meticulously sketched diagrams. She wore a baggy gray sweater over her uniform, its sleeves pushed up to her elbows. A pencil was neatly tucked behind her ear, her head bent low in profound concentration. Alistair remained motionless, sensing the fragile, sacred nature of the scene. Her lips formed silent words, rehearsing something from the text. Anatomical terms, he surmised. He could just make out the titles on the book spines. Advanced Human Biology, Principles of Organic Chemistry, Diagnostic Methodologies. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly surreal, that he momentarily questioned if he was dreaming. Ilara, his quiet maid, was studying medicine. He cleared his throat, not to startle but to gently remind her that a world existed beyond the printed page. She jolted, nearly toppling a mug of tea. Her eyes flew up to his, wide with shock, and for the very first time he truly saw them. They were a deep, dark brown, large and luminous, with the panicked intensity of a deer caught in a sudden blaze of light. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, scrambling to her feet so quickly that her stool scraped loudly against the tile. "I didn't think anyone—" "I didn't think." He raised a placating hand, her torrent of apologies ceasing. "No," he said, his own voice surprisingly soft. "It is fine. I was only coming for some water." She nodded with frantic speed. "Of course, sir. I'll get out of your way." He raised his hand again. "You don't need to." A beat of silence passed. He moved toward the island, poured a glass from the chilled dispenser, and then let his eyes fall to the open textbook. "What are you working on?" She hesitated, her hands twisting together in front of her. Her gaze fell to the floor. "An entrance exam," she whispered. "For an online pre-med program." He blinked. "I study after my duties are done," she added, her voice wavering with uncertainty. "I cannot afford traditional college, but if I pass this, there's a chance I could qualify for a distance learning scholarship." He looked again at the books, noticing now how worn they were. The pages were curled at the corners, the margins filled with tiny, neat notes. A diagram of a kidney was carefully rendered in colored pens. "You want to become a nurse?" he inquired. Her head lifted a fraction. Something flickered in her eyes then. Not defiance, but a spark of pure purpose. "A doctor," she corrected him. He didn't answer immediately. His mouth opened, then closed again. She stood there, awkward and exposed, bracing for a judgment that never came. He simply gave a slow nod, placed his glass on the counter and said, "Don't let me keep you." He turned and walked back the way he had come, but he paused in the darkened hallway, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light still visible behind him. He had never truly seen her until this moment. Not the girl who expertly folded his shirts, wiped down his tables, and never asked for anything beyond her duties. Not the silent figure who vanished into the linen closets and emerged hours later with everything pressed to perfection. He had only ever seen a servant, and now in a flash of unexpected illumination, he had seen a soul. Back in his room, Alistair didn't return to his bed. He stood instead by the vast window, watching the skeletal branches of the ancient trees sway against the night sky. A strange stillness had settled in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't discomfort, it was something else entirely. A stirring. The following morning he casually asked the house manager how long Alara had been in his employ. "Almost 3 years, sir," came the prompt reply. She arrived with excellent recommendations. "Very reliable, never asks for a thing. A quiet family, none here. I believe she sends her wages back to the Mississippi Delta." Alistair nodded, offering no further comment. But that night, and the night after, an impulse he couldn't control took hold. At precisely 2:15 a.m., he found himself pausing at the top of the staircase, listening. And each time he saw it. The persistent glow under the kitchen door, heard the faint whisper of turning pages, felt the rhythm of someone fighting for a life beyond this one. He started to notice her during the day, too. He saw the way she handled delicate china as if it were a treasured heirloom from her own past. He observed the slight private smile that touched her lips when the morning sun streamed through the stained glass panel in the east hallway. He realized that even when she thought no one was watching, she treated every surface of the house with a profound sense of care. He began to wonder about the dreams she held, not just the ones she pursued in the dead of night, but the ones she might have had as a child, the ones she had perhaps never dared to speak aloud. He began to question the truths he had long accepted as unshakable, the things he had inherited along with his wealth, attitudes, assumptions, blind spots. And so it began, not with a sudden cataclysm, not with a grand transformation, but with a second look, the kind of look that, if nurtured, could blossom into something far more potent than simple curiosity. Recognition. That was the seed of it all, planted in a moment between a man who possessed everything and a girl who possessed nothing, illuminated by the beam of a kitchen lamp cutting through invisible walls. The next morning Alistair found himself at the head of the long breakfast table, his newspaper open but unread, the coffee in his cup slowly turning cold. Across the sun-drenched room, the faint echo of polished shoes marked the butler's silent routine, and the distant drone of a vacuum cleaner signaled the day's orderly commencement, just as it always had. Every detail was in its place, precisely as it was meant to be. Yet the stillness, which had once been a source of comfort, now had a sharp new edge, as if a fundamental truth had shifted somewhere deep beneath the marble and plaster. The silence was still present, but it no longer felt like a loyal companion. It felt heavy, watchful. Alistair tapped a finger against his porcelain cup, trying to force his attention back to the article before him. Something about a corporate merger, the sort of strategic move that would once have captivated his interest. But the words swam before his eyes, dissolving into meaningless print. His mind, against his will, kept drifting back to the previous night, to the vivid image of Ilara hunched over her textbooks, her face illuminated by the kitchen lamp, every line of her body a testament to her focus. He tried to dismiss it as a mere anomaly, a curiosity, a private eccentricity he had stumbled upon and should promptly forget. But he could not. The scene had embedded itself in his consciousness like a splinter, not because it disrupted the order of his home, but because it had fractured something in the order of his world. Later that morning, feigning routine oversight, he summoned Mr. Corbin, the house manager. Corbin was a man of impeccable punctuality and composure, deeply loyal and possessing a profound understanding of discretion. "How long has the girl Ilara been with us?" Alistair asked, his tone carefully casual. Corbin adjusted his spectacles. 3 years and 2 months, sir." "She came to us from another estate?" "Yes, sir, a private residence on the Cape. Before that, several short-term posts, mostly live-in arrangements. Always glowing reviews. She keeps to herself. And her family?" Corbin paused. "She sends the majority of her earnings home. The Delta, I understand. I believe there are younger siblings. She never speaks of them. She is exceptionally private." Alistair nodded slowly. "And her conduct? You've had no complaints?" "Never, sir." Corbin's response was immediate and certain. "If I may be so bold, she is one of the most dependable staff members we have ever had. Her work is flawless. She asks for nothing, and she avoids any sort of friction. We are hardly aware she is here." That last sentence struck Alistair more forcefully than he'd anticipated. "We are hardly aware she is here." As if invisibility were the highest virtue a person could possess. He dismissed Corbin and retreated to his office, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just uncovered the edges of a vast, overlooked landscape, an entire life unfolding under his roof, as quiet as a breath and as steady as a clock, yet utterly unseen. That night he paused at the top of the stairs once more, this time not out of restlessness but with a sense of purpose. The hallway was cloaked in shadows, the grandfather clock in the foyer below marking time with its soft, rhythmic tick. The thread of light from the kitchen was there again, a pale, unwavering line. He descended with deliberate slowness, unsure of what he hoped to discover or what he might say if he was seen. He didn't enter the kitchen this time. He stood just outside the doorway, listening to the soft rustle of pages, the faint scratch of a pen, and the sound of her voice, a near inaudible whisper, reciting a litany of anatomical terms. There was a fierce determination in her tone, but also a deep well of fatigue. Her vowels had a slight melodic curl, the sound of the delta wrapping itself around Latin. Yet every word was clear. He stood there for longer than he intended. Something about the intimacy of it, the private struggle, the sheer unyielding discipline of someone squeezing a dream into borrowed midnight hours, left him strangely moved. He retreated upstairs before she could ever know he was there. In the days that followed, he saw more. It wasn't that Ilara had changed. She behaved with the exact same quiet efficiency as always. But now he saw her. He saw the subtle way she nudged a door closed to prevent it from creaking. He saw how she folded his shirts with a precision born not of compulsion, but of ritual. He noticed the worn edges of her shoes, and the way her fingers would linger for a fraction of a second on the piano keys as she dusted them, as if listening for a ghost of a melody from another life. She would sometimes hum under her breath, a tune he didn't recognize, but one that felt warm and full. It began to unsettle him. Then, one afternoon, he overheard her speaking softly on the phone near the service entrance. He wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but the door was ajar and her voice, hushed and trembling, carried. "No, I haven't told them. I can't risk this job, Lyra. You know I can't. If I pass, then maybe. Just maybe. But if I fail, then what was all of this for?" A pause. "I'm trying. I really am. Just pray for me, please. I don't have much time left." He moved away before she could see him, a knot tightening in his chest. There was something profoundly intimate about hearing someone confess their deepest fears to a distant voice, especially when that fear was so deeply entwined with sacrifice. He didn't sleep well that night. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for the name of the pre-med program she had mentioned. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. An online curriculum affiliated with a respectable state university. The entrance exam was a strict prerequisite. The tuition, while modest by his standards, was a fortune for someone earning her wage. He could find no mention of scholarships. He scrolled through pages of requirements, deadlines, and student testimonials. He read the course descriptions twice. Then he closed the browser and sat in the darkness, no longer sure of what he was doing or why he felt so compelled to care. The next few days were a strange blur of business calls, financial reports, the quiet, frictionless passage of another privileged week. But beneath the polished surface of his routine, Alistair felt a pressure building. He found himself watching Ilara more often now, watching her serve breakfast without ever eating herself, watching her slip into the garden on her breaks to water the plants long after her duties were done, watching her fingertips brush the spines of the books on his shelves like a silent prayer. One evening after dinner, he stood by the drawing-room window, a glass of scotch in hand, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. Behind him, the house was still. The only sound was the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner in the east wing, stopping and starting, then finally falling silent. He thought of what his father would have said, that a man should never meddle in the affairs of his staff, that charity was a dangerous distraction, that unchecked kindness bred dependency. And yet all Alistair could think about was the look in Ilara's eyes that night in the kitchen. Not fear, not even hope, but purpose. Undeniable, unshakable purpose. The following week something shifted. He found her again in the hallway late at night, crouched by the laundry room, books spread across her knees. She didn't see him until he cleared his throat gently so as not to startle her. She looked up, her expression caught between surprise and composure. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," he said. "You are not in trouble." She nodded, though her uncertainty was palpable. "May I ask what drives you?" he asked, the words feeling strange and foreign in his own mouth. She hesitated, then her chin lifted. "When I was 10, my father died in our living room. There was no doctor in our town. We couldn't afford the hospital trip. I sat with him for hours. He kept apologizing. I swore to myself I would never feel that helpless again." He said nothing. He didn't need to. In the quiet steel of her voice, he heard an echo of something long buried within himself, a grief so immense it had frozen him in place for years. He turned without another word, leaving her to the quiet. But that night, in the solitude of his office, he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to draft an inquiry, not to her school, but to his lawyer. It was the beginning of a scholarship fund, anonymous, clean, irrefutable. He didn't fully understand why he was doing it, not really, but a voice inside him whispered that sometimes the smallest light can change the entire shape of a room. And for the first time in years, he no longer feared the silence. He welcomed it, because it was no longer empty. The morning after Alistair messaged his lawyer, he woke before dawn. The sky beyond his tall arched windows was still bruised with the last shadows of night, and the aroma of coffee had not yet begun to weave its way through the halls. A part of him felt unsettled, like a story left on a cliffhanger. He rose, dressed in the pre-dawn quiet, and moved into the silent corridors of his estate, not yet certain of his purpose. He had become attuned to the rhythms of the house in a way he never had before. He knew, for example, that Ilara would be in the east corridor before 6, folding linens in the small room adjacent to the greenhouse. When he found her there, she was bent over a basket of crisp towels, her hands moving with a steady, practiced grace. The early light filtering through the window bathed her in a soft gold, and for a moment he simply stood there, watching, not as an employer observing his staff, but as someone slowly piecing together a long-ignored puzzle. Her back was straight, her eyes were focused, her jaw was set with concentration. There was no leisure in her movements. Everything she did carried a quiet urgency, as if she were in a constant race against time. She sensed his presence then and straightened, a flicker of apprehension crossing her face. She seemed to brace herself, though for what, he wasn't sure. "I hope I did not disturb you," she said quickly, her eyes cast downward. "Not at all," Alistair replied. He paused. "I was just walking." A silence stretched between them, not awkward but thick with unspoken words. He took a step closer, gesturing toward the linens. "You do this every morning?" She nodded. "Before breakfast is served. The humidity from the greenhouse can sometimes make the linens damp." Of course. He had never known that. In 3 decades of living in this house, he had never once considered the effect of greenhouse humidity on his towels. But she had. She saw the details, the small, important things he had always overlooked. Another pause. He cleared his throat. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, surprised by the gentle tone of his own voice. She looked puzzled but nodded again. He led her through the glass door into the greenhouse. It was warm and humid inside, the air rich with the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. Sunlight streamed through the curved glass ceiling, painting the floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Alistair indicated an iron bench beneath a cascade of ferns, and after a moment's hesitation, she sat. He remained standing. "I have been thinking," he began slowly, "about what you told me, about your father." She looked up at him, her gaze steady now. "I have not told many people that story," she said. "I can understand why," he replied. "It was not an easy thing to share." Elara gave a slight shrug. "It is not about easy. It is about true." That word true resonated with him. He sat on the bench opposite her, resting his hands on his knees. For a long moment he simply studied her face. There were faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, and her skin had the quiet pallor of someone who slept too little and worked too much, but there was a light in her gaze that no amount of weariness could extinguish. "You want to be a doctor," he stated. "Yes. Why not a nurse? Or a technician? Something less demanding?" She tilted her head slightly, considering his question. When she spoke, her voice was calm and certain. "Because I do not want to stop halfway." The answer settled in his chest like a stone. "You could have chosen an easier path," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But people die where I come from because there is no one there to help. Not just to clean a wound or check a pulse, but to decide, to act. I want to be the one who knows what to do." Alistair was silent. The wind rustled the leaves outside, a soft brushing against the glass panes. He looked away, suddenly conscious of how cold his own hands felt. "I never knew my wife had cancer," he said finally. "Not until it was too late." Elara didn't respond, but she didn't look away. "She didn't tell me," he continued, his voice now a low murmur. "I was busy. Meetings, markets, acquisitions. I just thought she was tired, that she would get better. By the time I truly understood, there was nothing left to be done." "I'm sorry," Elara said softly. He shook his head. "I think I was sorry too late." They sat in silence then, not the brittle silence of discomfort, but the deep, resonant quiet that falls when two people acknowledge a shared truth. "I am not telling you this to compare sorrows," he added, "but I see something in you, something that reminds me of what I lost, or perhaps of what I failed to see." Elara looked down at her hands, which rested quietly in her lap. "Most people do not want to see," she said. "They would rather assume." Her words held no bitterness, only a simple, profound honesty. "You are not most people." The words were out before he could stop them. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time he was struck by how young she still was. Young, but with eyes that had already seen far too much. "I should get back to my work," she said, rising. He stood as well. "Yes, of course." But as she reached for the door, he added, "If you ever need anything—" She paused. "I have already taken too much of your time." "No," he said, more firmly than he intended. "You have not." She gave a single brief nod, then slipped out the door, and was gone. That night, Alistair walked into his office and opened the file his lawyer had sent. The legal framework for an anonymous scholarship was straightforward. The paperwork was already drafted. It just needed a name. He wrote one without hesitation. The Serenity Fund, after his late wife. After her last act of grace, the day before she collapsed, when she had spent the morning tutoring children at a community center, laughing even as the pain laced through her every breath. The fund would be managed at arm's length. He would not be named. Ilara would simply receive a letter from the university's extension program informing her that an anonymous donor had covered her full tuition and materials. A stipend would be included for living expenses. No connection would ever be traced back to him. He signed the documents and sent them off that same night. A week went by. He said nothing. She said nothing. The rhythms of the house continued unchanged. Breakfasts were served, carpets were vacuumed, ledgers were balanced. Alistair even started reading his newspaper again. But now he saw the articles differently, noticing stories about healthcare deserts, medical discrimination, about students like Ilara who never made it past the gates of the institutions designed to keep them out. Then, one evening, he saw it. An envelope, peeking out from the waste bin near the laundry room, accidentally unearthed. He recognized the university's crest. The name on the letter was hers. He couldn't read the words, but he didn't need to. That night, Ilara lingered at the kitchen table longer than usual. Her books were open, but her pen was still. She was staring at the wall, her expression unreadable. He watched her from the shadows of the hallway, unseen. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded note. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes tracing the words. A small, private smile touched her lips. Then she turned back to her book and began to write again, her movements faster this time, more certain. Alistair turned away. Back in his room, he sat, on the edge of his bed, and stared at the floor for a long time. He did not feel proud. He did not feel heroic. He felt useful. For the first time in years, he had done something that didn't serve a board or a market. He had done something for one single person, and the world had not ended. The foundations had not crumbled, but the silence around him was different now. It had weight and shape. It was filled with the sound of a pencil scratching across paper, of pages turning, of a future being built, one word at a time. And somewhere in the depths of that silence, a single flame burned brightly. It was not his flame, but it illuminated the entire house nonetheless. The acceptance letter arrived on a rain-soaked Thursday. The sky over the estate had been a uniform slate of gray since dawn, and the house felt quieter than usual, as if the damp weather had seeped into its very walls, muffling every sound. Ilara found the envelope tucked into her small cubby near the laundry chute. Her name was printed on it in neat block letters, the return address that of the university. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat, before retreating to her small room and closing the door. She opened the letter sitting on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The paper felt thin and official. Her eyes scanned the first paragraph once, then twice. She was in. The program had accepted her. Tuition was fully covered. Materials were included, and a small monthly stipend was being provided through a third-party donor initiative. No names, just facts. She sat in stunned silence, the letter resting in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and elation. She had done it. After all the clandestine nights of study, all the whispered vocabulary words at 2 a.m, she had finally been seen, been chosen. But the euphoria was a fleeting spark. It quickly gave way to the looming practical reality she had fought so hard to ignore. To attend the program, even online, she would need time. Time for lectures, virtual labs, assignments. Time she currently spent scrubbing floors and ironing sheets. The stipend wouldn't be enough to cover the rent for her siblings back home or the cost of her mother's medication. It wouldn't stretch to buy school shoes for Lyra and Leo. If she quit this job to make time for her studies, the fragile support system she had built for her family would shatter. Her breath grew shallow as the weight of this impossible choice pressed down on her. The walls of her small room seemed to shrink. She folded the letter and carefully placed it in a drawer, beneath an old T-shirt from the Delta. For the rest of the day, she moved through her duties like a phantom, her body present but her mind a million miles away, her heart caught between a dream and a duty. That evening, Alistair noticed the change. He had grown accustomed to her quiet, steady presence, the sense of purpose that seemed to emanate from her every movement. But tonight, she was purely mechanical. Her answers were clipped. Her smile was a thin, forced line. There was a slump in her shoulders he had never seen before, a flicker of defeat in her eyes. Later, as he passed the staff corridor, he paused by her door. He could hear her pacing inside. Not the focused rhythm of thought, but the restless, caged shuffle of someone wrestling with an impossible dilemma. He raised a hand to knock, then let it fall. Instead, he made his way to the greenhouse. He sat among the ferns and orchids, the scent of damp earth usually calming, but tonight it did little to quiet the unease in his gut. He had thought the hardest part was giving her the opportunity. He had never considered that she might not be able to take it. The next morning, Ilara appeared at the door to his study. She had never come to him directly before. When he looked up and saw her standing there, clutching a thin manila envelope, he knew what was coming before she spoke. "I would like to speak with you, Mr. Finch," she said quietly. He rose and gestured to the seating area by the window. The rain had stopped, but the light outside was still pale and uncertain. Ilara perched on the edge of the chair, her hands gripping the envelope. "I received an acceptance letter," she said. "From the university." He inclined his head. "That is wonderful news." She gave a single sharp nod, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. "There is a scholarship," she continued. "An anonymous donor. Full tuition, monthly support." "I see." She hesitated, then her eyes met his for the first time. "Was it you?" The question hung in the air between them, as fragile as spun glass. He considered denying it, but the look in her eyes made any deception feel like an insult. "Yes," he said simply. "It was." Ilara let out a long, slow breath, not of relief, but of something far more complicated. She leaned back slightly, her fingers uncurling from the envelope. "I am grateful," she said after a moment. "Truly. But I do not think I can accept it." The words landed like a physical blow. "Why?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Because it is not just about me," she said. "My family depends on this income. If I take this chance, even if I am not fully gone, they will lose the support I provide." "You would not be gone. The program is online. But I would not be able to work the same hours. I could not send the same amount of money home. Rent is due every month. Medicine costs what it costs. I cannot be selfish." Alistair stood, pacing slowly. He had never felt so utterly powerless in the face of someone else's struggle. His entire life had been about finding solutions, about buying his way out of problems. But this was not a business deal. This was a human cost he could not simply absorb with a check. "What you call selfishness," he said finally, "I would call courage." She shook her head. "They need me more than the world needs another doctor." He turned to face her, his voice softening. "Ilara, you have spent your life giving to your family, to this job, to a system that has never given you anything in return. If you sacrifice your dream for survival, you will keep surviving. But you will never truly live." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she did not look away. "I am not asking you to abandon them," he continued, "but perhaps it is time someone else helped you carry the weight." She sat frozen, then slowly placed the envelope on the table between them. "I have never heard anyone say that to me before," she whispered. "Not once. I mean it." Silence descended, thick and heavy. Finally she lowered her head, her eyes closing. "I do not know what to do," she admitted. "You do," he said gently. You have just never been given permission to believe it." She opened her eyes and looked at him again, as if seeing him for the first time, not as her employer, but as an ally, someone who understood more than she had ever imagined. They sat there for a long time, the envelope between them like a fragile bridge. At last, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will try," she said. "I do not know how yet, but I will try." A breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped him. He did not reach for her hand. He did not say another word. But the look that passed between them was an agreement, unsigned but unbreakable. That night, Ilara returned to her room and began to pack, not with fear, but with a quiet, steely determination. She folded her uniforms, placed her worn textbooks in a borrowed satchel, and wrote a letter to her siblings, explaining that she was about to do something difficult, but that she would always be theirs. She taped a photograph of her mother, Lyra, and Leo beside her bed, and whispered a promise into the empty air. She was not walking away. She was stepping forward. In the days that followed, the estate felt different. The staff noticed that the halls, once filled with her quiet, constant presence, now felt unnervingly still. Alistair found himself in the kitchen late one night, staring at the empty stool by the island. He placed a cup of tea on the counter out of habit, then left it there, untouched. A point of no return had been crossed, and though the world around him remained unchanged, everything within him had shifted. He had spent a lifetime acquiring things, objects, properties, influence, but he had never before given someone a future, and now that he had, he knew he could never go back to being the man he was before. He found himself checking the mail with a strange sense of anticipation, waiting for a sign, a postcard, a letter, anything to let him know she had arrived safely, that the path he had helped illuminate was still open beneath her feet. One afternoon it came. A plain white envelope addressed in a familiar slanted script. No return address, but he knew instantly who it was from. He took it to his study, closed the door, and opened it with care. Inside was a single page. "I am here. It is overwhelming. I feel as if I have stepped into a world that does not know what to do with someone like me. But I am still walking, still trying. Thank you for giving me the space to begin." There was no signature. He placed the letter on his desk, then took a brass tack and pinned it to the corkboard above his bookshelf. The first of many, he hoped. Outside, the rain began to fall again, not a downpour, but a steady, cleansing shower. The kind of rain that doesn't flood, but nourishes, the kind that makes things grow. Ilara stepped off the city bus, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and a folder of documents clutched to her chest. The campus stretched out before her, not grand, but unfamiliar enough to make her heart pound. The sidewalks were still damp from the morning rain, and students swirled around her in laughing, chattering groups, all moving with the easy confidence of people who had always belonged in places like this. She hesitated for a moment at the edge of the main courtyard, took a slow, deep breath, and stepped forward. No one looked at her. No one noticed the frayed cuffs of her sweater or the scuffed shoes she had polished until her fingers ached. No one saw the way her hand trembled as she pulled open the heavy glass door to the science building and entered the world she had spent years dreaming of. Her first day was a blur of orientation packets, digital logins, and names she couldn't remember. She said very little, taking notes with a furious intensity, hoping that sheer effort could bridge the gap of everything she lacked. Her classmates were younger, louder, many of them fresh out of private schools, with expensive laptops and monogrammed water bottles. They talked about study abroad programs and shared anecdotes about professors with a casual familiarity that felt like a foreign language. Ilara kept to herself. She arrived first to every class and was the last to leave, her notes already organized in color-coded tabs by the end of the first week. She took on more than her share of the work in group assignments, her silence often mistaken for an unwillingness to contribute rather than a deep-seated fear of being wrong. In the evenings, she returned to the small apartment the university had helped her find. Bare walls, second-hand furniture, a hot plate in the corner, and studied until her eyes burned. The stipend she received from the anonymous grant was just enough to cover rent and groceries. Every spare dollar she earned from tutoring went straight to her family. Her mother's medication was no longer a monthly gamble. Lyra and Leo had new school shoes for the first time in years. Her days settled into a precise rhythm. Wake, study, lectures, notes, work, study again. She built a routine out of pure discipline, her mind a muscle she trained relentlessly. Her dreams no longer came to her in sleep. They were lived minute by minute, carved out of effort and silence. And still, the doubt lingered. In her second month, a professor presented a complex case study in immunology, asking the class to diagnose a fictional patient with a series of vague symptoms. The room fell silent as students flipped through their notes, brows furrowed in confusion. Ilara listened, then cautiously raised her hand. "The symptoms align with a rare presentation of Jobs syndrome," she said, her voice steady. "It's a variant of hyper-IgE. We covered it in the supplemental reading last week." The professor blinked, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Correct. Very well done." Heads turned in her direction. For the first time, someone asked for her name. The shift was subtle but irreversible. They began to notice her, not with condescension but with a growing curiosity. Who was she? Where had she come from? How did she know so much? She never gave long answers. She simply continued her work with a quiet, unshakable resolve. She moved through each day like a stone smoothed by a relentless river. Not flashy, but solid and real. Back at the estate, Alistair read her letters with a kind of reverence. She still sent them by hand, on folded notebook paper in simple white envelopes, never signed, but he knew her script. The slight slant of the letters, the faint pressure of the pen. She wrote about her studies, about the professors who challenged her, about the classmates who assumed too much. She never complained. She wrote of her small triumphs with humility, and her failures with resolve. And at the bottom of every page, she ended with the same phrase, "I have not forgotten why I started." Alistair kept every letter. He had long since run out of space on his corkboard, and had begun pinning them in a neat grid on the wall of his study. His staff never asked. His few guests assumed they were business memos. Only he knew the truth. They were evidence of something sacred. In the absence of Ilara's daily presence, the estate felt quieter, but it was no longer an empty quiet. It was the hush of growth, of slow, steady transformation. Alistair had changed too, incrementally at first, then profoundly. He began to listen more than he spoke. He quietly funded a community health initiative and started mentoring young entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds. His name was never attached. He declined interviews, but those who worked with him noticed the change. The man who had once measured his life in quarterly returns now found value in things that could not be graphed or filed. One crisp October afternoon, a new letter arrived. This one included a photocopy of an award certificate. Ilara had been recognized for academic excellence. It was unsigned, as always, but Alistair could hear her voice in the modest description of the ceremony, the way she had stood at the back of the auditorium, unsure if she should go up, until the professor called her name a second time. That evening, he framed the certificate and placed it beside her first letter. Later that week, she wrote about a mentorship program the university was starting, pairing advanced students with new enrollees. She had been accepted as a mentor. She would be helping other first-generation students find their footing. Her words in that letter were different, still measured, but with a new undercurrent of confidence, perhaps even the faint beginnings of pride. "I did not think I would have anything to offer," she wrote, "but maybe what I have carried can become a map for someone else." Alistair read that line 3 times. He sat for a long time afterward, staring out the window, the letter still warm in his hands. Outside, the trees were turning, the air was shifting. Even the estate, in its perfect symmetry, showed signs of change. The ivy on the walls had deepened to a rich crimson. Weeks passed, then months. Ilara continued to write. Each letter was a small victory. She described the feeling of walking into a lecture hall and no longer questioning if she belonged there. She wrote about a classmate who had thanked her after a study session, not because she had helped him pass a test, but because she had inspired him. She wrote about catching her reflection in a window, and, for a fleeting moment, not recognizing the person staring back, not because she looked different, but because she stood taller. There was no arrogance in her words, but Alistair could see it. the quiet revolution unfolding within her. She was becoming not just a student, not just a future doctor, but a woman who knew her own worth. Alistair never wrote back. He considered it, but always decided against it. This was her story, her voice. To reply would be to make it about him, but he showed his faith in other ways. Anonymous donations continued to flow to the university's fund. A second stipend appeared for Ilara under the guise of a supplemental academic award. A new laptop was delivered to her apartment with a typed note. For long nights and harder questions. She never acknowledged the gifts directly, but in one letter she wrote, "Whoever you are, you keep reminding me that the world is not as indifferent as I thought, that maybe kindness is not weakness. That belief, given freely, can be the strongest medicine of all." Alistair read that line aloud, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, the letter pressed against his chest. The world, he realized, did not change through force. It changed through fireflies, small, quiet, persistent lights, flickering in the darkness, showing others the way. And in Ilara, he had seen the first spark. 4 years had passed since Ilara last walked the winding gravel path to the Crestwood estate. The air that day was crisp and bright with the promise of early spring. The ivy on the mansion walls was fuller and a deeper shade of green. The house itself stood as a monument to constancy, unmoved by time. But Ilara had changed. As she stepped out of the modest sedan from the train station, adjusting the blazer on her shoulders, she felt that change in every fiber of her being. The estate looked exactly the same. The polished brass door handles gleamed. The hedges were trimmed to geometric perfection. The windows reflected the clouds like silent mirrors. But the girl who used to scrub these floors was no longer here. She hadn't disappeared, but she had been transformed. 4 years of relentless study, of nights spent tracing the intricate pathways of human anatomy, had carved someone new from the same bones. Her hand hovered over the doorbell. When she finally pressed it, the familiar chime sounded less like an alarm and more like a summons. The door opened slowly. Alistair stood in the doorway. He looked older, not drastically, but in the small ways that time reveals itself. His silver hair was a little longer. The lines around his eyes had deepened, but his posture was as straight as ever. And his eyes, when they met hers, were warm with recognition and something softer, something close to awe. She smiled. "Hello, Mr. Finch?" He shook his head, a soft laugh escaping him. "Not today." She laughed gently in return. "Hello, Alistair." He stepped aside, holding the door open. "Come in." She entered slowly, her heels clicking softly on the marble floors she had once polished on her hands and knees. The hall was the same. The art, the furniture, the faint scent of jasmine and wood polish. Yet everything felt new, not because the space had changed, but because she had. She no longer felt like a ghost in a borrowed room. They walked down the hallway in a comfortable silence. In the winter garden, sunlight streamed through the glass, casting lace-like shadows on the floor. He poured her a cup of tea without asking how she took it. She accepted it with a grateful nod. They sat for a few minutes without speaking. Then he looked at her and said, "I kept all your letters." She turned to him, surprised. "All of them?" "They are still on the wall," he said, gesturing toward his study. "When the house gets too quiet, I read them again." Her throat tightened. She had never known if he even read them, let alone kept them. "I did not expect you to," she said softly. He smiled. "You once wrote that belief given freely is the strongest medicine. I believe that now more than ever." She looked out at the orchids, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the quiet of the room. "I have never thanked you properly," she said after a long pause, "for what you did for me." "You owe me no thanks," he replied. "You did the work. You carried the weight. I only lit a path." She set her cup down. "But without that light," she said, "I might have stopped walking." He studied her for a long moment. "And now?" "Now I am ready for what comes next." "Tell me." So she did. She told him about her final exams, about the grueling clinic rotations, about the residency interviews lined up across the country. She spoke of her peers who had become allies, and the ones who had quietly sought her help. She described the sterile corridors of the hospital, the patients whose hands she had held, the nights when sleep was a luxury. Her voice was calm and assured. She no longer apologized for her ambition or questioned her place in the world. He listened with an intensity that was a gift in itself. When she spoke of her first patient, a child whose asthma had gone untreated for too long, she saw his jaw tighten, and in his eyes, she saw the echo of the man who had been awakened by a single light in the darkness. When she had finished, they sat again in a silence that was full and heavy, not with sadness, but with the weight of a journey completed. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Leaving?" She looked out at the garden. "No," she said, "because on the way back, I found myself." He nodded once, a deep, understanding gesture. They remained like that until the sun began to sink lower in the sky. When Alara rose to leave, he walked with her to the door. The farewell did not feel final, but like a new beginning. As she stepped outside, she turned. "I am opening a clinic," she said. "Not a big one. Just 5 rooms and a waiting area in the boroughs for people who cannot get seen anywhere else." He raised his eyebrows slightly. "You will need support." She smiled. "I have it." He inclined his head. "Then the world has just become a little better." She laughed softly. "I am not sure it is ready for me." "It will be," he said, "because you are ready for it." She stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked down the gravel path, her stride calm and unhurried. Back inside, Alistair returned to his study. The light was golden now, slanting across the room. He looked at the letters on the wall. The ink now slightly faded, but the words no less true. He reached for the newest one and reread the line she had added at the bottom. "I will not forget what brought me here. But I know, finally, where I am going." He tacked it to the wall and stepped back. The study was no longer a room of strategy and retreat. It had become a monument to quiet perseverance, to the sacred act of belief. He no longer thought of legacy in terms of empires or wealth. He thought of it in terms of stories, of people, of a girl who had once sat at his kitchen island under a flickering light and whispered the language of biology into the silence. And now she walked the world in a white coat, her name stitched in navy thread, her future built not on charity, but on strength. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, Alistair smiled. The house, unchanged in its bones, had become something else entirely. Alive. The air in the boroughs was different, thicker, humming with the constant energy of a city that never slept. It pressed in with the scent of hot pavement and street food, the distant pulse of music from open windows. This was a world away from the manicured silence of the Crestwood estate. Yet for Ilara, it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. Here life was not arranged for silence. It demanded to be heard. The clinic stood on a quiet block, tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a row of aging townhouses. The building itself was unremarkable, a low brick structure with mismatched windows, but inside it had a soul. The walls were freshly painted, the floors were scrubbed clean, the furniture was modest but functional. 5 rooms, 1 waiting area, 1 dream. It had taken months of permits, inspections, and endless meetings with city officials. Ilara had spent her evenings writing grant proposals, and her weekends scouring donation warehouses for exam tables and file cabinets. She had navigated the labyrinth of bureaucracy with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through medical school. She called it the Humana Clinic, a nod to the Latin root for compassion, for the belief that care should never be conditional. Above the reception desk, a simple sign read, "Everyone welcome. No questions asked." There was no brass plaque listing donors. The names that mattered were not etched in stone, but whispered in the waiting room in Spanish, Bengali, and Creole. Opening day was quiet. No ribbon cutting, no press, just a slow trickle of patients. A mother with 2 coughing children. An elderly man with swollen joints who hadn't seen a doctor in 5 years. A young woman too frightened to go to a hospital. They came hesitantly at first, wary of kindness without a price tag. But Ilara greeted each one with the same calm focus, asking not how they could pay, but what they needed. Her staff was small. 2 nurses from the neighborhood, a part-time receptionist, and a retired doctor who volunteered twice a week. The rest of the time, Ilara carried the weight herself, often staying past midnight to organize files and order supplies. She didn't mind. She had built something that mattered. And she was not alone. Though Alistair never visited during operating hours, his presence was a quiet, steady force in the background. Medical equipment was upgraded through anonymous donations. The rent was covered by a community grant that appeared just in time. A shipment of pediatric vaccines arrived, prepaid and untraceable. Each time Ilara smiled. She knew. One evening, as the sun set and the last patient left, she sat on the small bench by the entrance. The wall beside it was covered in a mural painted by the neighborhood children, their handprints forming the leaves of a vibrant tree. Footsteps approached, steady and familiar. When she opened her eyes, Alistair was standing before her. He looked thinner, more fragile, but his eyes were as clear as ever. "I was nearby," he said simply. She didn't rise. He sat beside her. They said nothing for several minutes, the sounds of the city a comfortable backdrop. "I figured," she replied. "I did not want to come inside. It is your space." "It is ours," she said quietly. "You helped build it, whether you admit it or not." He gave a small nod, his eyes on the mural. "They think the building is magical," she added. "The kids? Is it?" she asked. He smiled. "In some ways. It is built on something stronger than brick." He didn't ask what. He didn't have to. He reached out and closed his hand gently around hers. It was not a grand gesture, but in its stillness, it contained everything she needed to know. That he had never stopped believing in her. That he never wanted recognition, only to help her story unfold. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, their joined hands resting between them. The mural glowed in the sunset, and children's laughter floated from a nearby window. They had both been strangers once, she a girl with calloused hands and sleepless eyes, he a man hollowed by grief. But through silence and small acts of faith, they had found each other, and in doing so, found themselves. Love had never been spoken between them, not in the conventional sense. There had been no declarations, only a series of quiet, constant, undeniable actions. Perhaps that was its truest form, not something said, but something lived. Later, when Alistair rose to leave, he pressed her hand once more. Before he disappeared down the street, he looked back. "Keep the light on," he said. She nodded. "I always do." The next day, the clinic opened again. The waiting room was full before noon. A girl with a fever, a man with a chronic cough, a grandmother with no insurance. Ilara moved from room to room with the same steady presence she had once brought to the marble floors of a mansion. Only now the rooms held stories, not silence. Each day brought new faces, new needs, new exhaustion. But she did not falter because she was not carrying the weight alone. And because every time she touched a stethoscope to a chest or whispered reassurance to a frightened parent, she felt it. This was where she belonged. One evening, she found a wide envelope tucked behind the mailbox. No name, no stamp. Inside, a single sheet. "You have made something beautiful. Thank you for showing me that kindness is never wasted." She smiled and placed the note in her coat pocket. Later it would join the others, a private archive of her journey. In her office, the walls were bare except for one photograph, a grainy snapshot of a kitchen bathed in dim yellow light. A young woman sat at a table, a textbook open before her head bent low in concentration. She had not known anyone was watching. Now, that same woman stood beneath her own sign, her white coat crisp, her eyes clear, her hands steady. Not every story ends with love. Some stories begin with it and simply grow. The house where it all began still stood far away behind its iron gates. But in this new place, built from purpose and gentleness, the spirit of that house had found a new shape. Not in marble or silence, but in laughter, medicine, and light.